Saddam Hussein's rise to power in 1979 marked the beginning of a reign defined by fear, brutality, and absolute control. Following the U.S. invasion, the hunt for this elusive leader captured the world's attention, and on December 13, 2003, that search reached its climax. Saddam Hussein's early life played a big role in shaping the person he became. He was born on April 28, 1937, in a small village near Tikrit, Iraq. His family was poor and his father left before he was born. Saddam was raised by his mother and older brother, who were strict and tough on him. This difficult upbringing instilled in him a sense of survival and a desire for power. As a kid, Saddam faced many hardships. He grew up during a time of political turmoil in Iraq, and the environment made him aware of the power struggles happening around him. At a young age, he became involved in politics, joining the Ba'ath Party, which focused on Arab nationalism and socialism. This involvement would set the stage for his future rise to power. In his teens, Saddam moved to Baghdad to live with his uncle, who was part of the Ba'ath Party. This move was crucial for his education and political development. He became more radicalized, learning about political ideology and gaining confidence in his abilities. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had risen through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party, showing a knack for manipulation and ruthlessness. These early experiences laid the groundwork for Saddam's authoritarian style of leadership. Saddam's rule in Iraq, beginning in 1979, was marked by an unyielding quest for regional dominance, political control, and the brutal suppression of dissent. Almost immediately, he set out to establish Iraq as a dominant power in the Middle East, adopting policies that would not only terrorize his people, but also draw Iraq into devastating conflicts with his neighbors. His relentless drive to solidify his power and influence led to catastrophic consequences, both domestically and internationally. In September 1980, Saddam saw an opportunity to expand Iraq's influence following the chaos of the Iranian Revolution. Iran was grappling with internal strife, and Saddam aimed to exploit this instability by launching an invasion. This move was not just about territory. It was a calculated attempt to establish Iraq as the dominant power in the region. What followed was the start of the Iran-Iraq War, an 8-year conflict that would turn into a brutal and bloody nightmare for both nations. Initially, Saddam's military strategy focused on quick, decisive victories. His forces advanced rapidly, capturing strategic cities and oil fields. However, they quickly met fierce resistance from Iranian troops who rallied under the banner of nationalism and religious fervor. As the war dragged on, what began as a hopeful campaign for Saddam turned into a protracted struggle that neither side was willing to back down from, leading to a catastrophic stalemate. Throughout the war, Saddam adopted increasingly brutal tactics that drew international condemnation. One of the most horrific aspects was the widespread use of chemical weapons. Iraqi forces deployed mustard gas and nerve agents against both Iranian soldiers and civilians. In towns close to the front lines, Iraqi planes dropped toxic gas, causing unimaginable suffering. Survivors recounted the chilling moments when clouds of poison swept over their communities, leaving people gasping for breath and writhing in pain. Many suffered horrific injuries, while others lost their lives, unable to escape the deadly vapors. The impact of these attacks was devastating and long-lasting. Survivors often faced chronic health issues, including respiratory problems and psychological trauma. The scars of the war were not just physical. Families were torn apart and entire communities were left devastated. The suffering extended far beyond the battlefield. As the years wore on, the war turned into a grueling stalemate. By 1988, both Iraq and Iran were exhausted, having lost over 1 million lives combined. Despite the staggering human and economic costs, Saddam managed to frame the conflict as a victory in Iraqi propaganda. He portrayed himself as a hero standing against Iran, using this narrative to bolster his regime and justify their further repression at home. The aftermath of the war left Iraq deeply scarred, with infrastructure in ruins and an economy shattered. The toll of the Iran-Iraq War laid the groundwork for Saddam's continued authoritarian rule. In the wake of such a devastating conflict, he cracked down on dissent, instilling a culture of fear that kept many Iraqis silent. The war not only reinforced Saddam's power, but also set the stage for future conflicts and upheaval in the region, leaving a legacy of violence and suffering that would haunt Iraq for decades to come. Within Iraq, Saddam's regime was equally ruthless. governed by fear, surveillance, and an elaborate network of loyalists who ensured that any dissent was swiftly crushed. The Ba'ath Party, through which Saddam ruled, permeated every aspect of Iraqi life, enforcing loyalty and eliminating opposition. Citizens were aware that any criticism, no matter how small or private, could lead to imprisonment, torture, or execution. Friends, neighbors, and even family members were often coerced into spying on one another, creating an atmosphere where people lived in constant fear of being denounced. Saddam's regime maintained this culture of terror through a range of brutal tactics. Political opponents, religious dissidents, and even perceived rivals within the Ba'ath Party were systematically targeted. Torture and executions were common in Iraq's infamous prisons, where detainees suffered under unimaginable conditions. Among the methods reportedly used were electric shocks, severe beatings, and psychological torture, all designed to break the spirit of those who dared to question Saddam's rule. The entire country was essentially held hostage by a government that silenced opposition through fear, ensuring that Saddam's authority went unchallenged. His iron-fisted approach led to a deeply fractured society, with individuals living in isolation and suspicion of each other. One of Saddam's most horrific acts was the Anfal campaign, a genocidal assault on Iraq's Kurdish population in the late 1980s. The Kurds, who had long sought autonomy in northern Iraq, were seen by Saddam as a significant threat in his centralized control. In response, Saddam launched a systematic campaign aimed at eradicating Kurdish identity, forcibly depopulating Kurdish areas, and using chemical weapons to terrorize and decimate communities. The atrocities committed during the Anfal campaign are among the darkest chapters of Saddam's rule. Poison gas attacks on towns like Halabja left thousands dead, with survivors describing scenes of unimaginable horror. As gas bombs fell, people ran in all directions, desperate to escape the lethal fumes. But many succumbed to the poison that choked the air. Entire families were wiped out in minutes, with corpses strewn in the streets, and those who survived were left traumatized and permanently scarred. This was not only an assault on individuals, but an attempt to annihilate an entire community's culture and way of life. Beyond chemical attacks, the Anfal campaign included mass executions, forced relocations, and the destruction of Kurdish villages. Men, women, and children were detained en masse, with thousands forcibly disappeared and never seen again. It is estimated that up to 100,000 Kurds were killed in this campaign. In August 1990, Saddam's ambition led him to order the invasion of Kuwait, a neighboring nation with vast oil reserves that Saddam believed would bolster Iraq's struggling economy. This bold move, however, triggered international condemnation and provoked a powerful response from the US-led coalition. Within months, Operation Desert Storm commenced, marking the beginning of the First Gulf War. Coalition forces quickly overwhelmed Iraqi troops, driving them out of Kuwait in a decisive military operation. Though Saddam's forces suffered a heavy defeat, he managed to maintain his hold on power within Iraq. After the war, he unleashed violent crackdowns on internal uprisings, particularly in Shiite and Kurdish areas. Thousands were killed as Saddam sought to reassert control, using the full force of his military to crush any signs of rebellion. These brutal suppressions only solidified Saddam's reputation as a dictator who would stop at nothing to retain power, even in the face of international opposition and military defeat. After the Gulf War, Saddam's defiance of international sanctions and his alleged attempts to develop weapons of mass destruction made him a continued source of global concern. UN weapons inspectors were repeatedly blocked or limited in their investigations, fueling suspicions that Iraq was secretly developing chemical, biological, or possibly nuclear weapons. Saddam's refusal to comply with inspection protocols intensified international pressure, leading to years of strained diplomacy and escalating tension with Western nations, particularly the United States. The standoff culminated in 2003 when, after years of accusations and unheeded warnings, a US-led coalition invaded Iraq. The official justification centered on Iraq's suspected WMDs and Saddam's alleged ties to terrorist organizations, claims that were later questioned but underscored the pervasive fear that Saddam had instilled far beyond Iraq's borders. The invasion marked the beginning of the end for Saddam Hussein's regime. After decades in power, Saddam's grip on Iraq unraveled swiftly with the US-led invasion in March 2003. By April, coalition forces had taken Baghdad, and Saddam, once a symbol of absolute authority, had vanished. His sudden disappearance created suspense and speculation across Iraq and beyond. In Baghdad, a city shaped by Saddam's image and influence, his luxurious palaces stood eerily empty, looted, and abandoned. The city's residents, many of whom had known no leader other than Saddam, faced a surreal new reality, one in which their former leader had seemingly evaporated. Rumors of Saddam's sightings spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had fled to Syria or another country, while others believed he had gone underground, possibly protected by loyal tribal members. Yet despite numerous leads, Saddam proved elusive, and his ability to evade capture, even as Iraq was flooded with foreign troops, became a frustrating reality for the coalition forces. He remained a phantom presence. The U.S. military and the coalition recognized that apprehending Saddam would mark a turning point, both to symbolically end his reign of fear and to prevent him from potentially rallying support to destabilize the new Iraq. As the coalition forces intensified their search, they employed an innovative tool to streamline their efforts: the Most Wanted deck of cards, a concept designed to simplify the capture of Saddam and his closest associates. Saddam was designated as the Ace of Spades, representing the highest priority target, while each card in the deck depicted a member of his inner circle, from ministers to military commanders, all crucial in dismantling his regime. For U.S. soldiers and coalition forces, the deck of cards became an essential tool, allowing them to recognize key figures on sight. The cards emphasized the methodical nature of the mission. Each capture, each eliminated card, represented progress towards dismantling a regime built on fear. After nearly 9 months of fruitless searches and dead ends, a critical breakthrough occurred. Coalition forces had conducted hundreds of raids and interrogated countless individuals with ties to Saddam's former regime. This persistent intelligence gathering finally yielded a promising lead. U.S. forces obtained valuable information from a former driver and personal guard of Saddam's, who, under intense pressure, disclosed a possible hiding location near the village of Ad-Dur, close to Tikrit, Saddam's birthplace, and a region long loyal to him. Armed with this intelligence, the coalition prepared for Operation Red Dawn, a high-stakes mission meticulously planned to ensure success. The operation, named after the 1984 film about guerrilla resistance, involved extensive reconnaissance, careful intelligence analysis, and precise military planning. 2 target sites were identified, codenamed Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2. On December 13, 2003, coalition forces moved into position, each soldier acutely aware of the historical implications of their mission. The operation was carried out with heightened tension, as soldiers knew that a single misstep could allow Saddam to escape once again. As they combed the area of Tikrit, the troops' patience and precision paid off. At one of the locations, they discovered a small concealed hole covered with dirt and debris, a spider hole, in which Saddam had hidden. The entrance was well camouflaged and designed to blend seamlessly into the landscape. Inside, they found a disheveled and exhausted Saddam Hussein, armed with a pistol, but offering no resistance. The man who had ruled Iraq with an iron fist was now huddled in a cramped underground hideaway. As he was apprehended, soldiers noted that Saddam looked wary and defeated. The images of Saddam's capture circulated rapidly. For Iraqi citizens, especially those who had suffered under his regime, the sight of Saddam in custody offered a sense of relief and vindication. In Baghdad, jubilant crowds took to the streets, tearing down posters of Saddam and celebrating the fall of the man who had ruled their lives through intimidation and violence. Following his capture, Saddam was transported to Baghdad to face trial. Many legal experts voiced their concerns over whether the trial could genuinely adhere to the Geneva Convention's standards for the treatment of prisoners, especially in a country gripped by deep divisions and anger towards the former dictator. In the months leading up to the trial, preparations were underway amid protests, both from those who had suffered under Saddam's rule and from those who feared that a hasty trial might undermine the credibility of Iraq's fledgling justice system. When the trial finally commenced, Saddam Hussein adopted a stance that shocked both his supporters and detractors. Far from showing remorse or submission, Saddam exuded defiance, standing in the courtroom as if it were his own platform rather than a place of judgment. From the start, he questioned the legitimacy of the tribunal, dismissing it as a construct of the American occupiers and accusing it of political bias. He famously argued that the trial was nothing more than a show orchestrated by President George W. Bush and his allies, aiming to undermine Iraq's sovereignty and humiliate its former leader. The defiance didn't end there. Saddam repeatedly clashed with judges, his confrontational posture unsettling court proceedings and occasionally drawing murmurs of support from those who still saw him as a symbol of Iraqi strength. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, violence was escalating. Saddam's legal team faced threats, with several of his defense attorneys killed in targeted attacks, intensifying concerns over the trial's fairness and security. The threats and escalating tension made it clear that the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reflection of Iraq's deeply fractured state, where any semblance of due process struggled to stand against a backdrop of vengeance and unrest. The central focus of Saddam's trial was his role in the Dujail massacre, a tragic episode that underscored the brutality of his regime. It unfolded in July 1982, following an assassination attempt against Saddam during his visit to the predominantly Shiite town of Dujail. The attack, which resulted in minor injuries to Saddam, prompted an overwhelming response from his government, determined to eradicate any hint of dissent. In the aftermath of the assassination attempt, Saddam ordered a large-scale crackdown on the town. Security forces descended on Dujail, arresting over 140 men and boys, many of whom were accused of having ties to opposition groups or simply of being part of the community that had shown hostility towards the regime. The brutality of their treatment was extreme. The repercussions for the town were catastrophic. Families were torn apart, and entire households suffered under the weight of state-sanctioned violence. Many of those arrested were executed without trial, their only crime being their association with Dujail. In the courtroom, survivors of Dujail recounted their memories of that dark period. The testimonies were harrowing, shedding light on the personal cost of Saddam's unyielding rule. For these victims, this trial was a rare opportunity to confront the man responsible for their suffering. It was this atrocity, along with the overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors, that ultimately led to Saddam's death sentence. On November 5, 2006, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was met with both celebration and controversy. The verdict was swift, and despite appeals from his defense team, his execution was scheduled for December 30, 2006. The day arrived amid an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. A mobile phone recording of the execution soon spread globally, showing Saddam's final moments. Saddam's trial left a divided legacy. Was his execution the justice Iraq needed, or a hasty act driven by political interests? For many, the answer remains ambiguous. Despite Saddam's death, many from his regime remain unpunished. True justice for his victims feels incomplete, and Iraq is left grappling with the remnants of a painful past. Benito Mussolini, once the powerful leader of Italy, met a gruesome and humiliating end, which was one of the most brutal moments in history, and to this day, it remains unforgettable. Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in Predappio, a small town in northern Italy. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and a strong socialist who admired revolutionaries like Karl Marx. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a school teacher who was more religious and disciplined. Growing up, Mussolini was exposed to both strict education and radical political ideas. His father named him Benito, after Benito Juarez, a Mexican leader who fought against foreign rule. From a young age, Mussolini was rebellious. He got into fights and had a reputation for being aggressive. He was also smart, especially in writing and public speaking. In his teenage years, he was sent to a strict Catholic boarding school, but he was expelled for attacking another student with a knife. This violent streak would follow him throughout his life. As a young man, Mussolini became a journalist and a socialist. He wrote for socialist newspapers and supported workers' rights. In 1909, he moved to Trento, then part of Austro-Hungary, and edited a socialist newspaper called L'Avvenire del Lavoratore, the future of the worker. He was soon arrested and expelled from the region for his anti-government writings. By 1912, Mussolini had become an important figure in the Italian Socialist Party. He was a powerful speaker and writer, calling for strikes and protests. He was against war and believed Italy should stay out of World War I when it started in 1914. At first, he followed the socialist stance of neutrality, but soon he changed his mind. He believed war could bring Italy more power and expand its territory. This was a betrayal of socialist principles, and in 1914 he was kicked out of the Italian Socialist Party. Now a nationalist, Mussolini supported Italy's entry into the war. He started his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy, where he promoted militarism and patriotism. In 1915, Italy entered the war on the side of Britain and France. Mussolini joined the army and fought on the front lines, but he was wounded by a mortar explosion in 1917 and discharged. After the war ended in 1918, Italy was in chaos. Soldiers returned home expecting rewards, but the economy was in ruins. Inflation was high, jobs were scarce, and people were angry. The government was weak, and different political groups were fighting for control. Mussolini saw an opportunity. In 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, a political movement that mixed nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism. He promised to restore Italy's former glory and crush communists, whom he blamed for the country's problems. His followers, known as the Black Shirts, were violent thugs who attacked socialists, trade unions, and political opponents. At first, Mussolini's movement struggled. In the 1919 elections, his party failed to win a single seat in parliament. But over the next 5 years, his influence grew. The government was weak, and the people were desperate for a strong leader. Mussolini positioned himself as the only man who could restore order. In 1921, he officially founded the National Fascist Party. The party gained support from the middle class, business owners, and the military, all of whom feared a communist revolution. By 1922, Italy was in a political crisis. There were strikes, protests, and violence in the streets. Mussolini took advantage of the chaos and planned a coup. On October 28, 1922, he and his Black Shirts marched towards Rome, demanding that the king make him prime minister. King Victor Emmanuel III had the power to stop Mussolini by calling in the army, but he hesitated. He feared a civil war and believed Mussolini could be controlled. On October 29, 1922, the king gave in and appointed Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy. Mussolini didn't waste time. Over the next few years, he dismantled democracy. By 1925, he had full control over Italy, calling himself Il Duce, the leader. For nearly 2 decades, Mussolini ruled Italy with an iron fist. He crushed political opposition, controlled the media, and created a police state. His Black Shirts terrorized anyone who spoke against him. He built grand projects like highways and drained swamps, and promoted Italy as a strong nation. But while he wanted Italy to look powerful, the economy was struggling. Most of his projects were expensive propaganda rather than real progress. In the 1930s, Mussolini dreamed of building an empire. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, using chemical weapons and brutal tactics to crush resistance. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but no one stopped him. This made him feel invincible. By 1936, Mussolini had grown closer to Adolf Hitler in Germany. They shared similar views on dictatorship, military expansion, and crushing democracy. In 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel, a military alliance between Italy and Nazi Germany. When World War II broke out in 1939, Mussolini hesitated at first, but by June 10, 1940, he decided to join Hitler, declaring war on Britain and France. He believed the war would be short and that Italy could grab land. But Italy was not prepared for a long fight. Mussolini's military campaigns were disastrous. His army failed in Greece, struggled in North Africa, and was humiliated in Russia. By 1943, Italy was losing badly, and the people turned against him. By mid-1943, Mussolini's grip on power was slipping. Italy's military efforts in World War II had gone poorly. The Italian army was struggling, morale was low, and the people were exhausted from years of hardship. The Allies invaded Sicily on July 9, 1943, marking the beginning of their push into Italian territory. As the situation worsened, King Victor Emmanuel III and several high-ranking officials decided that Mussolini had to be removed. On July 24, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council held a secret meeting where a vote was taken on Mussolini's leadership. The vote was against him. The next day, on July 25th, Mussolini was summoned to the royal palace in Rome, where King Victor Emmanuel III informed him that he was no longer in charge. The king declared that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would take over as the new leader of Italy. Mussolini was arrested as soon as he left the palace. Fearing that his supporters might try to free him, the government moved him to different locations before finally imprisoning him at the Hotel Campo Imperatore, a remote mountain hotel in Gran Sasso, deep in the Abruzzo region. This location was chosen because it was isolated and difficult to reach, ensuring that Mussolini had no contact with the outside world. With Mussolini gone, Italy switched sides. On September 8, 1943, the Italian government signed an armistice with the Allies, officially surrendering. Italian troops abandoned the fight against the Allies and in many cases turned against their former German allies. But Mussolini's story wasn't over yet. Hitler refused to let Mussolini fall. On September 12, 1943, German paratroopers launched a daring rescue mission known as Operation Oak. They flew gliders to the mountain hotel, overpowered the guards, and freed Mussolini without firing a shot. Hitler made Mussolini the leader of a puppet state in northern Italy called the Italian Social Republic, also known as the Republic of Salo. But by now, Mussolini was just a shadow of his former self. He had no real power, and his fate was already sealed. By late April 1945, World War II in Europe was coming to an end. Nazi Germany was collapsing under the weight of the Allied forces, and Italy was in chaos. The Allies, along with Italian partisan resistance fighters, were closing in on the last strongholds of Mussolini's puppet government in northern Italy. Town after town was being liberated, and the fascist regime was crumbling. Mussolini knew he was running out of time. His once loyal supporters were abandoning him, and even the Germans, his only remaining allies, were preparing to surrender or retreat. He had no army left, no power, and no safe place to go. The war was lost. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini made his final, desperate attempt to escape. That day, he was in Milan, where he planned to make a last stand against the advancing Allies. But when he arrived, he realized that there was no one left to fight for him. The people of Milan had risen up in rebellion, and the partisans were taking over the city. At this point, Mussolini received a message from Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, who offered to mediate a surrender. Mussolini met with leaders of the National Liberation Committee, the group that led the resistance. But he refused to step down. He still believed that somehow he could escape and regroup. Realizing he could not stay in Milan, Mussolini and a small group of loyal fascists quickly left the city and headed north toward Como. But he still had no clear escape plan. At first, he considered fleeing to Germany, but the roads were too dangerous, and the Germans were already falling apart. Instead, he decided to head towards Switzerland, hoping to reach a neutral country where he could avoid capture. Mussolini was not alone. His mistress, Clara Petacci, refused to leave his side. She was deeply devoted to him and insisted on staying with him no matter what. Along with them were a few high-ranking fascist officials and German officers. Mussolini knew that traveling as himself was too risky, so he disguised himself as a German soldier, wearing a gray Luftwaffe overcoat and helmet, hoping to blend in with the retreating German convoy. The convoy itself was made up of German SS troops and Italian fascist officials who were also trying to escape. They were headed north towards the Swiss border, following the road along Lake Como. The plan was simple. Mussolini would hide among the Germans, pass through partisan checkpoints, and then cross into Switzerland. But things didn't go as planned. On the morning of April 27, 1945, Mussolini's convoy reached the small town of Dongo, located along the western shore of Lake Como. This area was controlled by Italian partisans who were on high alert, searching for any fleeing fascists. The partisans in the area belonged to the 57 Garibaldi Brigade, a group of communist resistance fighters. led by Pier Luigi Bellini della Stella and Urbano Lazzaro. The partisans had set up roadblocks to stop any remaining fascist officials from escaping. As Mussolini's convoy approached, the partisans blocked the road and demanded that the German troops surrender. The Germans, knowing that the war was over and that fighting was pointless, quickly gave up. They handed over their weapons and allowed the partisans to search the vehicles. As the partisans inspected the convoy, they began pulling out Italian fascists who were trying to escape with the Germans. One by one, they identified several high-ranking officials, including government ministers and military officers. At first, Mussolini stayed inside one of the trucks, silent and hoping not to be recognized. But Urbano Lazzaro noticed something strange. He saw a short, stocky man with a pale face wearing a German soldier's coat. The man's face looked familiar. Lazzaro later recalled that Mussolini looked tired, scared, and defeated. The partisans ordered Mussolini to step out of the truck. He obeyed, but said nothing. When they pulled off his helmet and coat, it was immediately clear who he was. Unlike his earlier years, Mussolini did not fight back. He was then transported to a farmhouse in the nearby village of Bonzanico, where he was kept under guard. The partisans debated what to do with him. Some suggested turning him over to the Allies, but most believed that Mussolini should be executed immediately. At this moment, Mussolini was a prisoner of the Italian people, and they wanted justice. The morning of April 28, 1945, was cold and overcast in northern Italy. The war in Europe was nearly over, but in a small village near Lake Como, history was about to witness the brutal end of Benito Mussolini. By dawn, orders came from the National Liberation Committee in Milan. A partisan leader named Walter Aldisio, known by his codename Colonel Valerio, was chosen to carry out the execution. Around 2 p.m., Aldisio and a small group of partisans arrived at the farmhouse. They ordered Mussolini and Petacci into a red Alfa Romeo. The car began its short journey to Giulino di Mezzegra, a quiet village a few miles away. The car came to a stop, and the partisans ordered Mussolini and Petacci to get out. Petacci refused to let go of him. The partisans positioned them in front of the stone wall, where the execution was set to take place. At exactly 4:10 p.m., Walter Aldisio raised his French MAS-38 submachine gun and pulled the trigger. Mussolini was hit in the chest. Petacci screamed and lunged towards him, but before she could even reach the ground, she too was shot multiple times. But the execution didn't stop there. The group unloaded their weapons into Mussolini's already lifeless body. Estimates suggest he was hit more than a dozen times, though some sources claim over 40 bullets tore through his corpse. However, the hatred for Mussolini and everything he represented was so strong that simply killing him wasn't seen as justice. After Mussolini and Petacci were gunned down, their bodies, along with the corpses of other executed fascist officials, were thrown into the back of a truck. The partisans did not rush to hide the evidence of their actions. Instead, they deliberately paraded the bodies through town after town. By the time the truck entered Milan in the early hours of April 29th, thousands of people had already heard the news. His body was being brought to Piazzale Loreto, a public square in the city. The partisans did not pick Piazzale Loreto by accident. It was a symbolic location, a place where Mussolini's own regime had committed a horrific act less than a year earlier. On August 10, 1944, Mussolini's fascists had executed 15 anti-fascist resistance fighters in the same square. Their bodies were dumped on the ground and left there for hours, exposed to the sun and flies, as a warning to anyone who opposed the fascist regime. Now, almost 9 months later, Mussolini himself was about to suffer the same fate, but much worse. The truck rolled into Piazzale Loreto, and the bodies were dumped onto the ground like garbage. People rushed forward. Some of them kicked Mussolini's body and his face, while others spat on it. Several men pulled out pistols and fired more bullets into his corpse. Even Clara Petacci's body was not spared. Though she had no real political power, The mob viewed her as an extension of Mussolini. Her corpse was kicked, beaten, and torn, just like Mussolini's. The other fascists' bodies were also subjected to the same treatment. But Mussolini took the brunt of the violence. After hours of beating, spitting, and shooting, the partisans decided it wasn't enough. They found a metal beam at a gas station on the edge of the square and decided to hang the bodies upside down for all to see. The corpses of Mussolini, Batacci, and 4 other fascists were hauled up by their feet using thick ropes and meat hooks. For some, the brutality was unsettling. Even Winston Churchill, who had fought against Mussolini, later said that executing him was one thing, but the public mutilation of his body was something else entirely. But for many Italians, it was justice. It was revenge for 2 decades of dictatorship, war, and suffering. After several hours, the authorities ordered the bodies to be taken down. They were placed in cheap wooden coffins and taken to a local morgue. At first, no one knew what to do with Mussolini's body. There was fear that fascists might try to recover it and turn it into a shrine. So the government buried him in an unmarked grave in Musoccio Cemetery outside Milan. But the story wasn't over yet. In 1946, a group of hardcore fascists stole Mussolini's body from the cemetery. They took it on a secret journey across Italy, hoping to give him a proper fascist burial. The authorities eventually tracked it down, and for 11 years, Mussolini's body was kept hidden by the government. Finally, in 1957, the Italian government gave in to requests from his family and allowed his remains to be buried in his hometown of Predappio. Today, Mussolini's tomb in Predappio still attracts visitors. Some are diehard fascists who still admire him, and others come out of historical curiosity. For over 2 decades, Ceausescu's Romania lived under a harsh dictatorship where fear was the currency and freedom was crushed. But in the cold winter of 1989, the walls of his regime started to crumble faster than anyone expected. The people's fury exploded in the streets, marking the beginning of a revolution that would change Romania forever. Nicolae Ceausescu rose to power in 1965, positioning himself as a leader who stood independently against Soviet dominance. This independence gained him some international attention and domestic support, as Romanians hoped for reforms and a break from Moscow's heavy-handed influence. However, Ceausescu's leadership soon revealed a darker side. His vision of control went far beyond typical authoritarian rule. In 1971, after state visits to China and North Korea, he became deeply influenced by the cults of personality surrounding Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung. Inspired by their total control over society and their larger-than-life images, Ceausescu introduced the July Theses, a series of strict guidelines designed to tighten ideological control over Romania. These decrees increased censorship across all forms of media, reinforced nationalist propaganda glorifying Romania's past and socialist future, and pushed a cultural policy demanding that art and literature strictly follow socialist realism, a style that glorified communist ideals and ignored any critical or alternative viewpoints. The cult of personality Ceausescu cultivated was both pervasive and obsessive. He was hailed with grandiose titles like the Genius of the Carpathians and the Danube of Thought, elevating him to almost mythical status. His face was everywhere. Children were taught to idolize him from an early age. His speeches were mandatory listening for everyone, reinforcing his image as a leader above reproach. This glorification extended to the point of absurdity, creating an atmosphere where questioning the regime was almost unthinkable. Under Ceausescu's rule, control wasn't limited to propaganda. It infiltrated every corner of daily life. The secret police, known as Securitate, became one of the most feared institutions in the country. This vast surveillance network monitored citizens constantly. People lived with the fear that even whispered criticism or private conversation could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Media outlets were tightly censored to ensure only the regime's narrative was broadcast, and foreign books, music, and films were banned to limit outside influences. This created an isolating and oppressive environment that stifled freedom of thought and expression. One of the most controversial and tragic aspects of Ceausescu's social policy was Decree 770, introduced in 1966. This decree banned abortion and severely restricted access to contraception in an attempt to boost Romania's population. The consequences were devastating. Many women resorted to unsafe, illegal abortions, resulting in increased maternal deaths and injuries. This policy showed how Ceausescu's control extended even into the most private aspects of people's lives, treating them as tools for state objectives rather than individuals with rights. Additionally, Ceausescu launched the Systemization Program, a brutal urban planning effort that aimed to modernize Romania by demolishing entire villages and relocating their populations into uniform apartment blocks. This program destroyed centuries-old cultural landmarks and fractured tight-knit rural communities. The human cost was immense, as many were forced into harsh living conditions, uprooted from ancestral homes without regard for their traditions or preferences. In the early 1980s, Romania faced a severe economic crisis. By 1982, the country's foreign debt had ballooned to over $13 billion, prompting Ceausescu to implement drastic austerity measures aimed at repaying these debts. This decision led to widespread shortages and a significant decline in the standard of living for the Romanian people. To achieve his goal, Ceausescu mandated that a large portion of Romania's industrial and agricultural production be exported. This policy resulted in domestic shortages of essential goods, including food, fuel, and medical supplies. By 1983, the standard of living had fallen by 19 to 40%, according to IMF figures. The government's focus on exports led to severe rationing of basic necessities. Electricity and heating were often unavailable, especially during the harsh winters. Hot water was typically restricted to 1 day per week, and unannounced power cuts affected even hospitals, leading to tragic consequences. For instance, in the winter of 1983, dozens of babies in neonatal intensive care units died due to power cuts to the incubators. Food shortages became chronic, and a rationing system for basic foodstuffs like bread, milk, cooking oil, sugar, and meat was implemented in 1981. Ceausescu introduced a rational eating program, claiming that Romanians were consuming too much and needed to reduce their calorie intake by 9 to 15%. This policy further exacerbated malnutrition and public discontent. The healthcare system suffered significant cuts, with expenditures on housing reduced by 37%, healthcare by 17%, and education, culture, and science by 53% between 1980 and 1985. These reductions led to an increase in infant mortality rates and the spread of diseases due to the reuse of medical supplies like hypodermic needles. While the general population endured these hardships, Ceausescu embarked on grandiose construction projects. The most notable was the Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, one of the largest administrative buildings in the world. Construction began in 1984, and to make space for it, over 10,000 homes were demolished, displacing more than 40,000 people. The building's construction involved forced labor and resulted in numerous worker deaths. Ceausescu's wife, Elena Ceausescu's role was just as dark. Despite lacking formal education beyond primary school, she ascended to prominent positions within the government, including deputy prime minister. Her rise was marked by a combination of political maneuvering and the cultivation of a public image that often belied her actual qualifications. In the 1950s, Elena began working at the National Institute for Chemical Research in Bucharest. She later obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry through night courses and was awarded a PhD in chemistry. However, the legitimacy of her academic achievements has been widely disputed. Reports suggest that her doctoral dissertation, titled Stereospecific Polymerization of Isoprene, was not her original work, but was instead authored by a group of Romanian chemists under duress. Despite these controversies, Elena was named as a co-inventor on several patents and received numerous honorary awards for scientific achievement during her husband's rule. Elena's influence extended beyond the scientific community into the political sphere. She held multiple high-ranking positions, including chairing the National Council on Science and Technology and the National Council for Science and Education. Her involvement in governance was characterized by a reputation for being domineering and intolerant of dissent. She was known to berate ministers and officials, contributing to a climate of fear within the government. Nepotism was a hallmark of the Ceausescu regime, with Elena playing a central role in promoting family members to influential positions. Over a dozen members of the Ceausescu family held high official roles, often abusing their power for personal gain. By the late 1980s, the winds of change were sweeping across Eastern Europe. Countries that once seemed locked under communist rule were breaking free. In Hungary, barbed wire was removed from the border with Austria, allowing thousands of East Germans to escape to the west. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, had gained power after years of resistance, resulting in semi-free elections in 1989. East Germany saw mass protests through the fall of 1989, which eventually brought down the Berlin Wall on November 9th. But Ceausescu wasn't listening. While leaders in other communist states tried to reform or at least negotiate, he doubled down on control. He continued to praise Stalinist-style rule and publicly condemned the Soviet Union's reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, Ceausescu believed Gorbachev was weakening socialism. He saw himself as the last true defender of communism in Europe and refused to accept that change was coming. Meanwhile, tensions were boiling under the surface in Romania. Economic hardship, censorship, and political repression were pushing people to the edge. But open resistance was extremely dangerous due to Securitate. On December 16, 1989, authorities tried to evict Pastor Laszlo Tokes, a Hungarian-speaking cleric, accused of making anti-government statements. Supporters formed a human chain outside his home. By the evening, hundreds more had joined. The crowd grew angrier as word spread. Many of them weren't just there to support Tokes. They were angry about food shortages, lack of heat, and constant fear. They began shouting slogans like "Freedom" and "Down with Ceausescu." The government's reaction was brutal. On December 17th, Ceausescu ordered troops to fire on the crowds. Tanks rolled into Timișoara, and soldiers opened fire with live bullets. Eyewitnesses later described scenes of people running through the streets, blood on the sidewalks, and armored vehicles crushing civilian cars. At least 66 people were confirmed dead, though many believe the real number was much higher. Some bodies were taken to mass graves or secretly cremated in Bucharest to hide the scale of the massacre. Instead of crushing the movement, this act of violence lit a spark across the country. For the first time in decades, people realized that the regime was no longer invincible. Word of the massacre spread fast, even though the government tried to block the news. In some areas, brave individuals hijacked radio signals or smuggled out footage. Foreign news outlets began reporting on the events and international pressure started building. On December 20th, workers at the big factories in Timișoara joined the protests, shutting down production. They marched through the city, chanting anti-regime slogans. The military presence was still strong, but some soldiers hesitated to shoot. That same day, Timișoara declared itself a free city, no longer under communist rule. This was a bold and dangerous move, but it didn't stop there. By December 21st, demonstrations had broken out in cities like Sibiu, Cluj, Brașov, and eventually the capital, Bucharest. Many of the protesters were young, students, factory workers, and even members of the military. They had grown up knowing only Ceausescu's rule, but now they were pushing back. In schools, teachers joined their students in marching. In factories, entire shifts of workers walked off the job and took to the streets. The country was unraveling from within. Inside the government, confusion was spreading. Some regional leaders started refusing orders to suppress protests. Others fled their posts. The military, long loyal to Ceausescu, began to splinter. Junior officers and enlisted soldiers were witnessing the crackdown firsthand and were uncomfortable firing on their own people. Faced with rising unrest, Ceausescu attempted to project strength. On that same day, on December 21st, Ceausescu reorganized a mass rally in Bucharest's Palace Square, now known as Revolution Square, intending to demonstrate his continued control. Approximately 100,000 people were assembled, many of whom were workers brought in under threat of job loss, and provided with pro-government banners and flags to create an image of widespread support. Ceausescu began his speech by condemning the protests in Timișoara, attributing them to foreign interference and fascist agitators. However, just over a minute into his address, a disturbance in the crowd escalated into widespread booing and jeering. Ceausescu, visibly stunned, attempted to calm the crowd by raising his hand and calling for silence. But the unrest continued. In an effort to regain control, Ceausescu announced minor increases in wages and pensions. But these concessions failed to placate the crowd. The live television broadcast of the event was briefly interrupted, but the images of a confused and faltering leader had already been transmitted across the nation, undermining the perception of his unassailable authority. The rally's future marked a turning point in Romania's revolution. Protests intensified in Bucharest and other cities, and the following day, December 22nd, the military withdrew its support for Ceausescu. Realizing he had lost everything, Ceausescu and his wife fled Bucharest by helicopter. Their pilot, Colonel Vasile Malutan, soon landed in a field near Titu, citing the danger of anti-aircraft fire. From there, the Ceausescus commandeered a car driven by a local doctor, Nicolae Deca, who transported them to Vacaresti. After Deca alerted the authorities, the couple switched vehicles, with Nicolae Petrișor driving them towards Târgoviște. During the journey, they listened to radio broadcasts detailing the revolution's progress, which Ceausescu dismissed as a coup d'etat. Upon reaching an agricultural center near Târgoviște, they were confined in an office and later arrested by soldiers from a local army garrison. Then they were taken to a military base in Târgoviște, where they were held in custody. Colonel Andrei Kamenici, the base commander, received orders to protect them until further instructions. Despite their detention, Ceausescu remained defiant, insisting he was still the legitimate leader of Romania. He demanded meetings with the colonel multiple times a day, often resulting in confrontations. The decision to execute them came at a moment of intense pressure and chaos in Romania. Ion Iliescu and the newly formed National Salvation Front, which took power after Ceausescu's fall, faced an urgent need to stabilize the country and show that justice was being served. They were seen not only as symbols of decades of oppression, corruption, and economic ruin, but also as potential rallying points for loyalist resistance. The leaders felt that a drawn-out legal process would risk giving them time to regain influence or allow unrest to deepen. For these reasons, a rapid military tribunal was established, bypassing many standard legal procedures. This tribunal charged the couple with genocide, abuse of power, undermining the national economy, and attempting to flee with stolen public funds. The trial, held on December 25, 1989, lasted about 1 hour. Throughout, Nicolae refused to acknowledge the tribunal's legitimacy, maintaining that he was still Romania's rightful president, while Elena angrily shouted insults at those present. The execution itself took place immediately after the sentencing at approximately 2:50 p.m. on Christmas Day, within the courtyard of the military base in Târgoviște. Both Ceausescus were led to a wall where a firing squad composed of paratroopers awaited. Accounts describe Elena's refusal to be separated from Nicolae during their final moments. The volley of bullets was swift, ending their lives within seconds. Eyewitnesses recalled how one of the bullets knocked Nicolae's cap off before he collapsed on the ground. Crucially, a cameraman recorded the execution, and parts of this footage were later broadcast on Romanian television. For many citizens, witnessing the end of the Ceausescus on screen was a defining moment. Internationally, the execution shocked observers. While some condemned the speed and nature of the trial and death sentence, others recognized it as a harsh but necessary step to close a brutal chapter in Romanian history. The Ceausescus were buried in unmarked graves within a Budapest cemetery, a secrecy intended to prevent their graves from becoming shrines or rallying points. For years, the exact location remained a subject of speculation. Only in 2010, after persistent demands from their children, were exhumations performed, and DNA testing confirmed the identities of the remains. Despite their deaths, Romania struggled with the unresolved legacies of their regime. Investigations revealed vast amounts of stolen wealth. Estimates suggest the Ceausescus amassed billions in ill-gotten assets hidden in secret bank accounts and properties abroad. The full scale of human suffering also remained difficult to quantify. But historians agree that tens of thousands of Romanians were imprisoned, tortured, or killed during their rule, with some estimates exceeding 60,000 victims. After the executions, Romania faced an incredibly difficult period of transition. The country's economy was devastated, crippled by years of mismanagement and Ceausescu's disastrous policies, which had prioritized debt repayment over citizens' well-being. Factories were often outdated and inefficient, and many were unable to compete in a rapidly changing global market. Agriculture, once the backbone of Romania's economy, had suffered from forced collectivization and neglect, leading to food shortages and widespread poverty. The immediate post-revolution years were marked by instability and uncertainty. The new government was made up largely of former communist officials who had reinvented themselves as reformers. This continuity complicated Romania's path to real change, as many citizens saw these leaders as merely old faces in new roles. The government struggled to dismantle the old systems of control while trying to stabilize the country economically and politically. Inflation soared, unemployment grew, and essential goods remained scarce. Everyday life was a challenge for many Romanians as they tried to adapt to a new system that promised freedom but delivered hardship. Politically, Romania moved slowly towards democracy. The first free elections after the revolution were held in 1990, but they were marred by controversy, protests, and accusations of fraud. The ruling National Salvation Front secured a majority, which frustrated many who wanted deeper reform and a clean break from the past. Over the next few years, opposition parties grew stronger, and civil society began to take root. In 1991, Romania adopted a new constitution that established a multi-party democracy, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, assembly, and press for the first time in decades. This was a crucial step, laying the foundation for Romania's future governance. Despite these advances, the shadow of the Ceausescu era lingered heavily. Older generations in particular carried deep scars from years of repression, censorship, and economic hardship. The fear instilled by the secret police had made people wary of expressing dissent openly. Romania's international standing improved gradually. In 2004, the country joined NATO, signaling its alignment with Western security structures. Then in 2007, Romania joined the European Union, a major milestone that brought investment, development funds, and greater political stability. EU membership also pushed Romania to implement important reforms in the judiciary, human rights, and anti-corruption measures, helping the country move closer to European norms. Even with these successes, Romania's post-communist journey was a complex mix of hope and hardship. The transition from dictatorship to democracy, and from a planned economy to a market system, was neither quick nor easy. The wounds left by Ceausescu's rule shaped Romanian society and politics for decades, influencing everything from economic policies to the way people viewed their government.